Evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 27th annual Sheinberg Lecture. This and our first Sheinberg Lecture over Zoom. I'm Naomi Sunshine. I'm chair of the Sheinberg Committee. I want to briefly tell you about our namesake, Rose Sheinberg. She is a 1950 graduate of NYU Law School and was a woman ahead of her time in many ways. She was motivated to go to law school by Red Scare activities in New York in the 1940s. And to honor her memory, her niece and nephew, Jill and Richard Sheinberg, set up this committee and lecture series. I can't tell if Jill and Richard are here with us tonight, but I hope they are. They're activists in their own right, and they have been amazing supporters of this lecture series and our committee for many, many years. The Rose Sheinberg Committee invites a lecturer working at the intersection of race, class, and gender to the law school each year. We've had an incredible lineup of speakers over the years, and many of their lectures are available on our website. You can check that out now. You can check it out later at your leisure. Our introducers have also been incredible and accomplished radical advocates in their own right. And I'll tell you about this year's introducer in just a few minutes. But before that, I want to tell you something else that's really important about the Rose Sheinberg Committee, and that is its structure. The committee is student-led. The students choose the lecturer and do all the work involved in planning the events. I want to acknowledge and give my heartfelt thanks to our current student members. We have 3Ls, Lauren Wilfong, Vaden Anthony North, and Samuel Dunkel, and 2Ls, Crystal Okafor, Daniel Kim, and Alina Tulloch. And I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity while you are all here to do some recruiting. Each year after the lecture, we start our process of recruiting 1Ls to students to join the committee. So please look out for an email and docket post about joining the Sheinberg Committee. It's a really important feature of our committee that we're student-led, and that was by design and always brings new energy and ideas to our work. I also want to acknowledge the faculty members of our committee, Alina Das, professor in the Immigrant Rights Clinic and an amazing advocate, Liz Chen, lawyering professor, and Sylvia Law, who's the founding chair of the committee, who's been an inspiration to many of us for many years. I also want to give huge thanks to my PILC colleague, Shirley Wu, who's been instrumental in making this event happen. And we also have an incredible group of co-sponsoring organizations. I think we have over 25 this year, which is more than we've ever had. And I was lucky enough to say that last year too. We really appreciate the support and sponsorship. And though our sponsors are listed on our website as well. I want to turn for a minute and talk about logistics. So after my introduction, we'll hear from our introducer, Dorothy Roberts, who I'm about to tell you about in a couple of minutes. And then our main event, our lecturer, Kara Page, will share some more of her amazing wisdom, which she began to share with us today during the lunch. Then we'll open it up to questions. If you have questions, we encourage you to put them in the Q&A, type them in the Q&A at any time. You can type them in before or during the Q&A session, and my committee colleague, Alina Tulloch, will moderate the questions. Again, you can type your questions in the Q&A before or during the question and answer period. Now, in other years when we've done this event in person, we have a reception after the lecture where we all enjoy some food and drink, reflect on the evening, catch up with old friends, and make some new ones. We can't recreate that tonight, but we are doing a couple of things to try to make up for it. First, as a memento of this evening, we want to give you something that will continue to nourish you and challenge your thinking. So we have a keepsake for you, chosen by tonight's guest speaker. We have 100 copies of the book, Beyond Survival, Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement. This is an anthology focusing on strategies for accountability beyond the criminal justice system. We're going to put a description of the book in the chat, so you can read that at your leisure. to claim your copy, and we really hope you all do. We really would love to send you this book. Please just fill out the survey that's also going to be placed in the chat with your name and mailing address, and we'll have the book mailed to you. We're excited to partner with Blue Stockings Bookstore in making the book available to tonight's attendees. The other thing we're doing to try to recreate that post-lecture opportunity to reflect and socialize, after the Q&A, we're going to have a bunch of breakout rooms. To do this, we'll need to switch to a Zoom meeting. Technology is wonderful, but has its limitations. So we're going to put the meeting link in the chat at the end, and we'll ask you all to switch over to the meeting. If we can, we'll try to email you as well, if we have that functionality. You'll be able to choose which breakout room you go to. There'll be people in the main room to help you with that. And each one will be moderated by a member of our committee. It's really an opportunity to reflect and socialize and talk in small groups. So we hope to see you there after the lecture and Q&A. And now, finally, I'm thrilled to get to introduce you to Dorothy Roberts. Professor Roberts is an acclaimed scholar of race, gender, and the law. She holds joint appointments at the University of Pennsylvania's Carey School of Law and Department of Africana Studies and Sociology, and is the founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society in the Center for Africana Studies. Her path-breaking work in law and public policy focuses on urgent contemporary issues in health, social justice, and bioethics, especially as they impact the lives of women, children, and African Americans. Her major books include Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, Shattered Bonds: The Color of Child Welfare, and Killing the Black Body: Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. She is the author of more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, as well as a co-editor of 6 books on such topics as constitutional law and women in the law. Among Roberts' recent scholarship is the sweeping essay, Abolition Constitutionalism, which appeared as the foreword to the Harvard Law Review's volume on the 2018 Supreme Court term. She serves on the board of directors of the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform and on the advisory board for the Center for Genetics and Society, among many other leadership positions. We're thrilled to have her tonight to introduce Kara Page. I'm going to turn things over to Professor Roberts now. And while I do that, please remember to fill out the form to get your book. All right, thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Naomi, for that introduction. I am so honored and thrilled to have been asked to introduce Kara Page as this year's Distinguished Rose Sheinberg Lecturer. Now that I have learned more about the origins of the lecture, I can see even more how Kara is the perfect person to give this lecture. It's really hard to capture who Kara Page is and what she does. She's one of the most creative and dedicated and amazing people I know working at the intersecting struggles for racial, gender, and economic justice and healing justice and transformative justice. What I love most about Kara's work is the way she not only has a critical analysis of intersecting oppressions, but she's imagining the most wonderful ways to resist them and to build a new world without them. And this is the challenge for abolitionists today, to not only dismantle inhumane and unjust systems, but also to build a world without those systems. It takes imagination, and that is what Kara Page is so brilliant and dedicated to doing. So, as I said, it's hard to capture who she is and what she does. So I am going to tell you how she describes herself as a Black, queer, feminist, cultural memory worker, a curator, and an organizer. For more than 30 years, she's organized with the LGBTSQGNCI Black, Indigenous, and people of color liberation movements in the United States and the Global South. Right now, she's leading a new project, an exciting project called Changing Frequencies, which you can learn more about online. And it's an archival memory and cultural change project to intervene on generational trauma. It seeks to unveil and hold accountable the medical industrial complex as an extension of state violence and policing. That's an area that many people don't see the connection to other abolitionist movements. And it's really important to understand how medicine and healthcare that are supposed to protect us also can be extensions of state violence and policing. She's one of the architects of the healing justice political strategy envisioned by many in the South and deeply rooted in Black feminist traditions and Southern Black radical traditions. Another thing that's so remarkable about Kara's work is that she reaches into our history of healing and justice. We have these examples that we can turn to, and she does that and then creates wonderful ways of extending them and applying them to the challenges we have today. She's a co-founder and current leadership team member of the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. Kara is also the former executive director of the Audre Lorde Project and former national coordinator of the Committee on Women, Population, and the Environment. She's a recent recipient of the Open Society Foundation's Soros Equality Fellowship for 2019 to 2020, and an activist in residence at the Barnard Research Center for Women. Now, of course, all of that work takes organizing with lots of people, and she organizes with many organizations nationally and internationally, including Southerners on New Ground, Project South, Insight, Women and Trans People of Color Against Violence, and National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network. All of this toward building racial, gender, and healing justice strategies for our liberation, care, and protection. Her lecture this evening is entitled New Cosmologies for Freedom in the 21st Century, and it reflects her work as a Black feminist on this moment of revealing fascism, white supremacy, and anti-Black racism during a global pandemic. And she'll explore themes of generational trauma from slavery and colonization and help us move toward healing justice and transformative justice strategies that build collective power and safety within our communities. This is just the message we need at this moment when we need to figure out how to build a new world that doesn't require these punitive and violent forms of state action to meet people's needs. Not that it really does require them at all, but there's no excuse for them. There's no need for them. In order to do that, we have to be creative and figure out new strategies. And we have to, as Kara points out, build collective power and build ways to truly be safe in our communities and truly care for each other. And so it's just so meaningful that Kara is the speaker for tonight and that she can share with us her wisdom and inspiration to guide us forward in this struggle. So I'm honored, so honored, and so happy for you, Kara, to introduce you for your lecture tonight. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, and to everyone in the preparation of the Rose Sheinberg lecture series. I just want to give my deepest gratitude to you, Dorothy, for your visionary work as a Black feminist, as a lawyer, as an organizer, as a mother and grandmother. You are my heroine and an inspiration for movements and Black feminism and just transformation, period, for Black people. You give voice to the unspoken and elevate our experiences, moving us out of a victim, object, subject idea and into Black women as leaders, as bodies, as spirits. And you see and hear our collective stories and have told time and time again our relationship to power and resistance despite white tyranny, misogyny, reproductive oppression, archaic ideas of population control, eugenics, and white supremacy, all those things. And you lift me up and so many people up. So just deepest, deepest gratitude to you and your work.
I feel the same about you,
Yes,
Kara. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Deepest thanks to Naomi and Shirley, who were behind the scenes. Well, Naomi just introduced herself, but all the inner workings that it takes to create these spaces for a generative conversation. And it's a deep honor to be invited by the students and to be trusted by the sponsors for this lovely event to be in conversation with this community. So I want to start just a little bit. Well, first, I just want to honor the ancestors. So if we just take a moment just to honor the ancestors that bring you here to this space and to also honor the land that we are on. I am calling in from Lenape land, and I am always by way of my people, a great-granddaughter of Black Seminole Nation and formerly enslaved African people in the South. I deeply, deeply want to call forth my ancestors to be in the space that I would not be here if I was not a conduit of those that have come before me. So I just want to talk a little bit about healing justice, the then and the now, and the ongoing to the future. In this heightened awareness of this moment of COVID, and in the heightened awareness of this radical visionary uprisings of Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, really all over the world against fascism, against racial capitalism. This is a moment of actually imagining, as Dorothy said, what does it mean to create systems outside of the state? Many of us have been doing this work for a very long time, but there is a very central visible location that we are in right now to disrupt and dismantle what was before, what wasn't working, and to reimagine what we can create for our collective care and safety towards the future. So this evening is really an ask, an invitation to everyone here and those we touch and move and work with, our thought partners, our comrades, our peers, thinking about what we are wanting to create towards future. For me, rooted in Black liberatory, Black and Indigenous Southern radical traditions, and Black and global South feminist futures, I am always asking to all my peers and comrades, what can we bring? What can we build together? What is possible? And what can we imagine for our liberatory futures that will center Black bodies, immigrant and refugee bodies, Indigenous bodies, disabled bodies, queer, trans, and gender nonconforming and intersex bodies, centering working class and low income bodies and communities, centering sex workers and people living in street survival economies, centering incarcerated and institutionalized communities, all of us that have been discarded and left behind. I want to go to some slides just to open up the conversation on healing justice. So this work started it's almost 20 years from now, that in the Southeast, at a particular moment of increased fascism, we were looking at, in the South, inside of labor movements, racial justice, migrant justice, environmental justice, and the reproductive justice movements, we were wrestling with this moment, that being in the early 2000s, of how to interrupt crises, right? How to interrupt fascism, how to interrupt white supremacy. I'm starting with this slide just to briefly touch on the role of land, body, and spirit is deeply interconnected in the Black radical tradition of organizing in the South. And at the time, in the early 2000s, I was looking at ways we are experiencing the privatization of genes and seeds. I had the opportunity to meet with Global South farmers and organizers who were fighting against the privatization of seeds, or had really been doing that since the 80s. But I went to Brazil and sat down with some of these global human rights defenders, and they asked, where was the US on the privatization of seeds when corporations were buying our land and buying our seeds and taking our medicines? And now there's so much focus on the privatization of genes in the early 2000s, or the patenting of genes. It's a little late, they said. Where were you? Because seeds and genes are inseparable, right? We're talking about the biological materials of Indigenous people all over the world that's being privatized at a high, high cost that is more about not just profit, but the cost of our survival and the cost of losing our medicines and the cost of being criminalized. And so I returned back very much looking at how do we heal from these incidences of violence that are really not just against our skin, but literally against our genetic makeup and the privatization of us, those being Black, Indigenous, people of color in the US, in the global South, in the world. And how do we consider our relationship always to land and body as integral to our political liberation? So this slide speaks briefly to that what we were fighting against, or what we are fighting against in understanding our relationship to profit around land, body, genetic materials for seeds and genes, is understanding that the government military inside of its biodefense is building a global security in this world that's deeply rooted in biocolonialism, that's deeply rooted in privatizing, policing, surveilling, exploiting, and experimenting on our bodies, that being Black, Indigenous, people of color, and extracting our resources, our medicines, our survival practices, I would say. And that is all deeply rooted in a racial capitalism that is only, of course, valuing that we as Black people, Indigenous people, as people of color are only reproducing for the wealthy elite, and that we don't have these medicines for ourselves, that they are not ours, they are always for the profit of the 1%. And so looking at that in relationship to multinational corporations, to government and medical clinical research that's happening all over the world, and to looking at the extension of prisons, detention centers, and policing of bodies and biological materials, in the early 2000s, I started to ask the question, where are we understanding our relationship to generational trauma from these kinds of violence and disassociation and control of our land, of our bodies, of our seeds, of our genes, but really of our patterns, our survival strategies, our medicines. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the question of understanding our relationship to biocolonialism, I had to go back and say, what are the pillars that are deeply rooted in believing that we, as communities of color, as Indigenous, as Black people, are needing to always be controlled or having our literally our genetic materials taken from us. And so population control and eugenics play a very important part in this, but sometimes we forget that these ideologies, old and archaic ideologies from white, Christian, able-bodied, wealthy, straight men, that still set the course for our relationship now to war and policies that are deeply rooted in these ideas. Population control, of course, being this idea that women of color's fertility is the root cause of environmental degradation. And then I call it the perfect marriage to 100 years later, eugenics by Francis Galton. I'm sorry, population control was coined by Thomas Malthus out of his fear that the planet would die unless Black, Indigenous, and people of color were not, that it was our fault that natural resources were dying. So he wanted to suggest that in order to make sure white people have access to natural resources, that you have to control and contain communities of color and Black communities and Indigenous communities, but really through the lens of controlling birthing and reproduction and blaming population on the reproduction of people of color in the world. And then later marrying this idea of eugenics, right, where this idea of who's unfit and who's fit to survive, but even deeper than that, who is seen as healthy, who is seen as able to reproduce for the wealthy elite, for capitalism, and who is seen as dependent and not able to reproduce, so therefore expendable, which is a very ableist concept, right? Because it targeted people with disabilities. It is a racist concept because it targeted people of color and Black people. It is a homophobic and transphobic idea because it is always about removing those who are not seen as being the normal, that being straight, white, Christian, male, and able-bodied. And so this informs ethnic cleansing in the public health system. These two ideologies, this perfect marriage, are the backdrop to how ethnic cleansing begins in this country for immigrants from Eastern Europe. And certainly these are the backdrop to the colonization and enslavement of Black and Indigenous people in this country. We can go to the next slide. So what is the medical industrial complex? It's important to name this before we get to healing justice, because this is what we were responding to in the early 2000s. I just jumped back into history for a moment, but in the early 2000s, we had to reckon with how is this system, the system of care and health, rooted in scientific racism, rooted in population control and eugenic ideologies and biocolonialism. Why and how are we still relying on this system, and how can we hold this system accountable? So the medical industrial complex, otherwise known as the MIC, just a quick definition that I'm using, deeply informed by many movements in the global South. And the phrase was coined by Barbara Ehrenreich, the phrase of the medical industrial complex, in her book, The American Health Empire. But this definition is a working definition, that it relies on wealthy, white, cis, heterosexual, able-bodied, and Christian ideals, as I've said, on whose body is healthy and whose is diseased. It goes so far to also define whose body is pure and whose body is sinful. Sins Invalid speaks a lot to this in their disability justice work as a performance troupe in San Francisco, because this idea of healthy is very much connected to purity and very much connected to able-bodied. The medical industrial complex also prescribes who is expendable, who deserves access to quality and dignified care, be that spiritual, emotional, physical, psychic, environmental, and who's actually offering the care. That it's presumed that white bodies should be preserved, should be the ones taken care of. The rest of us as Black and brown bodies are only to serve and preserve and keep those white bodies safe and cared for, and that our caring for each other is not seen as central. It also presumes, the MIC presumes, that determining some of us have a predilection to criminality. Some of us are already pathologized when we're born based on our race, our ethnicity, our class, our ability, our gender. And so that predescribes what is beauty, what is desirable, and who deserves to survive and exist solely for the purpose of labor and production. And then finally, the last two is just to quickly say, as an extension of state control, the MIC uses institutions of medicine as a platform for surveillance, policing, and erasure. So it's not all medicine. It's just looking at the ways some medical abuses, some harms that are deeply rooted in infrastructure of medicine are believing that it should be also an institution used for surveillance and policing. So how do we disrupt that where it's being used as a platform for scientific racism and medical abuse? And it relies on fear to employ curative models and militarize disease under this guise of global security. We saw that during COVID, right? We saw some people getting denigrated, that being Chinese communities being denigrated and attacked for being seen as the disease, the carriers of disease. And then we could slowly watch it, how that might shift when the next community is blamed for the disease. This happened with HIV/AIDS and Black people. This happens with Ebola in Africa. This idea that a population will always carry disease forth. And so how do you use global security to actually militarize who has access to care and who is blamed for that disease and doesn't have access to care? Next slide, thank you. So it feels important just to name these things because healing justice seeks to interrupt this. I just want to say, another part to the medical industrial complex is understanding that this has deep impacts on the individual, collective, and generational trauma of many of our communities. And so when we think about colonization and slavery and attempted genocide of many communities in this world, we're looking on the passing of memory of the emotional, physical wounds of a traumatic incident, generation to generation, that I believe on a cellular level, the passing on of generational grief that is unhealed and unresolved from colonization and slavery is deeply embedded in our collective ways of being. So having studied from the works of Dr. Maria Yellow-Horse Braveheart, understanding that if we are not looking at resolving or holding the grief from unhealed trauma from generations behind us, that we are carrying forward the trauma of the original wounds of slavery and colonization, then how will we be able to survive, right, without always having this trauma with us? So where are there ways to transform that trauma in real time inside of communities and inside of movements as part of a political strategy? Okay, next, thank you. So we have a few more slides, but just briefly, this is just another visual to think about generational, individual, and collective trauma in the center, right, of being deeply impacted by systemic oppression in these green circles. And then the corners, right, that how are we literally, collectively, generationally holding trauma in our collective bodies and spirits and psyche from colonization and slavery, from population control and eugenics, from racial capitalism and systemic oppression, and just understanding that this is also political work to see how generational trauma is carried forth in our political work, how do we respond to it, right? Next slide. So this is how healing justice really came to be, is looking at the patterns of trauma from slavery and colonization, but in particular, in a moment in the Southeast in the early 2000s, we also saw a response to increased fascism, increased policing, increased anti-Black racism, increased anti-immigration reform, reproductive violence, so on and so forth, that we as a collective of healers, multiracial, intergenerational, as healers, health practitioners, birth workers, therapists, and social workers said, we need to understand in the South how we will integrate and organize collective care, healing, and safety strategies that are rooted in movement building, that seek to transform the generational trauma I just spoke about and build systems or traditions of care that center our collective well-being as critical and integral to our political liberation. And that network is called this Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective. Next slide. And inside of that collective, we coined the phrase healing justice. And I'm going to just describe what healing justice is on this next slide. The definition of healing justice, I was like, here's the big reveal. I'm not sure if we're having to, oh, here we go, thank you. The definition of healing justice, oh, sorry, next slide. I'm just going to jump ahead. Perfect. It's a political strategy to intervene on generational trauma from systemic violence and oppression, to intervene on policing and violence by recovering and remembering ancestral traditions and medicines, or building new traditions that will center our psychic, emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, and environmental well-being for our collective liberation. And that was healing justice, right? Is we were exploring how do you interrupt generational trauma from these oppressions, but also what will we build that centers our well-being in relationship to our collective land, our environment, our emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual and psychic well-being. Great, that's the next slide. And that was integral to political liberation. And now that might seem common. There's a lot more people talking about that. How do we embody power? How do we hold well-being in our collective bodies? But in the early 2000s, there was not as much conversation about that without it coming through, about trauma, without it coming through a social lens. It wasn't community-led, except for the harm reduction movement that I think really bridged that gap between being able to talk about trauma, survival strategies, and healing. But healing justice allowed for another way to embed it in movement. How will we look inside of our movements and say, as part of doing political organizing work, we want to also hold healing from oppression. Our values in healing justice as a political strategy are that collective trauma can be transformed, and that it's not just individual, but that how will we build collective responses to our collective trauma and not isolate people out. There's no single model or right model of care, and that community must have the autonomy, and I would say the audacity and the agency to choose how we want to heal in our communities, that we can tap into different kinds of modalities without being criminalized for our traditions and practices. It also says healing strategies, our values, our healing strategies are rooted in place. And for us in the South, we are rooted in Black and Indigenous Southern ancestral traditions. And that it's almost our duty, our calling to remember traditions that have been stolen from us as an extension of the colonialist project. And then finally, the value of holding anti-capitalism as a Black feminist lens or a strategy, that we were abolitionists, not wanting to force anyone to go through institutions that did not have their care and safety at the center, and centering disability, reproductive, transformative, and environmental justice analyses. And I'm just going to talk briefly about about disability justice and transformative justice and what those analyses are. Thank you. Next slide. Disability justice in 2005 was also emerging. And mind you, healing justice is a political strategy, I would say, but disability justice is a movement. And in the early 2000s, Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, Stacey Milburn, Leroy Moore, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret were pushing through a second wave of disability rights and pushing for a disability justice lens that looked beyond charity or a rights model, but rooted a disability justice frame, which really says here, quote, able-bodied supremacy has been formed in relationship to intersecting systems of domination and exploitation. That within the violence of heteronormativity, within white supremacy, gender normativity, our various bodies and multiple communities as people with disabilities have been deemed deviant, unproductive, and invalid. And that the disability justice framework allows for all bodies being unique, being essential, and having strengths and needs that must all be met. And that in order for us to build power, we must move together with each other, valuing all bodies and all the abilities as an anti-capitalist strategy and critique. And then just one more slide, thank you. And then that's a lot to say, but I just want to lay it here because the disability justice movement has done so much work on fighting eugenics, right? These old beliefs, these old ideas, as I mentioned earlier, of who is fit and unfit to survive and who is valued for their bodies and their, without being solely valued for the purpose of reproduction of labor. And then finally, transformative justice. Oh, interesting, technical difficulties. Essentially, transformative justice is survivor-led and community-led. And it is a framework, again, and/or a movement that centers safety, but the safety is defined by community, not by state, not by corporations, but by our own communities as survivors that are committed to healing also from generational, collective, and individual trauma. And transformative justice seeks to build it to relate to an abolitionist frame because it does not believe violence, to create punishment, to stop violence is just creating more violence. So how do we hold accountability and transformation for our communities, for even people, both survivors and people who cause harm? How do we hold everyone together and understand that we don't want to punish people who cause harm when so often they are survivors themselves? So what does it mean to be in community together and not seek to punish, but seek to hold accountability practices and look and understand how do we transform our relationships to each other that does not rely on violence and the state? And that's all for the slides. I have a few more things. Oh, we can close that out. It's okay. Thank you so much. I have a few, so this is the basis of why we're here, right? So I want to speak a little bit to now what? Now that you know what healing justice is and it's evolving, how do we apply it? What is critical about this moment is that we have the opportunities, I believe, to build cosmologies for freedom that are rooted in healing justice, in transformative justice, and disability justice. Because it is a moment of finding our way towards collective care and safety that is rooted in harm reduction and rooted in abolition. We are in a moment of creating alternative economies of food, of farming, of traditional medicines, and alternatives to policing. Black Lives Matter is leading the call against police brutality and the killing of Black people and rising up to fight against policing in prisons. Mi Gente and the campaign against one more deportation is dismissing the machinations of US imperialism and racial capitalism by detaining global South, people from the global South under the false guise of global security and naming it for what it is as US imperialism and global white tyranny. We are in a moment of the rise of alternative solutions, or maybe they're not even alternative, they're future solutions, they're traditional solutions to respond to safety and care outside of the police, outside of corporations, outside of state institutions that often do not permit our community and self-determination to build care for ourselves. And so we are seeing this growth of beautiful formations like mutual aid networks, pods, safety teams, different kinds of bodies of people coming together to care and build protection and safety for one another. We are at an urgent moment to take care of our lands and preserve them from man-made, corporate-made fires, floods, and land grabbing. And this is the critical moment of the rise of our survival strategies in COVID, in anti-white supremacy. We are looking at a moment of the earth renewing and regenerating because we had to pause, right, during the quarantine. And for a moment, we were able to sort of allow the earth to begin just slightly to regenerate and try to find its balance inside of a huge imbalance. And I believe that moment opened up our relationship to land and body and spirit. And for this moment in this past year, we were able to center the role of healers, the role of health practitioners at the center of our collective survival, not just within state, but the role of healers and frontline healthcare workers in understanding they are holding us. And what does it mean to wrestle and reckon with what care looks like in the world, and who will be the conduits of our safety and protection outside of state? I've been invited here because of the work that I have done in community, in movements around generational trauma, using healing justice as a political framework. And I believe in the work of the Kindred Southern Healing Justice Collective and in the work of multiple organizations and movements that are beginning to imagine healing justice as a political frame, that the opportunity we have before us is to honor and remember what we need to interrupt the displacement from our land and practices, and to remember we have resisted and been able to pass on traditions generation to generation. We've been able to interrupt the disassociation from our collective bodies as an extension of slavery and genocide and capitalism. We have still managed to find a way out of no way to create and recreate our grounded practices for our collective survival. And even though it was the colonialist project's attempt to erase our practices and memories, we are able to sustain and create community-led care and safety strategies. And we are beginning to remember what has been stolen and lost so that we are rooted in place, right down to our DNA and genetic makeup, that we cannot and will not ever forget what holds us, what pulls us forward to our unimaginable futures. The present calls on us to elevate ancestral lineage and ancestral technologies of care and safety and protection for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, for white people, for communities that need to understand how have you contributed or participated in the tyranny that has taken us away from our practices and traditions, and how can you change your relationship to that tyranny? We are in a new way of thinking, and to be able to honor and even be here in this lecture series, speaking to generational trauma and the MIC, the medical industrial complex, reminds me we are in a new moment of power and transformation. I believe that we are in a moment of cosmological shifts that will change our future. And through Black radical imagination and political rigor, I stand before you as I draw from our past of people of color liberation movements, of healers, of healthcare workers who have transformed ways they have honored and held healing and traditions, of Indigenous farmers, of freedom fighters who have used salves and medicines and remedies as part of their liberation. We are on the forefront of something new, something remembered, and something yet to be claimed. By remembering our medicines, not big pharma, but the herbs and roots and salves as part of our work against colonization and slavery, that we are remembering healing is integral to our political liberation. During COVID, we saw our collective nervous system rise and rise, and we had to give pause, right? We had to take a moment to the day-to-day capitalist machine. We had to be in our collective grief, our collective survival, our collective dying, our collective memorial. And we saw the grace and power of people taking care of each other outside of the state. We saw creation and formations of frontline workers, root workers, birth workers, curanderas move through this tragedy and hold us in our collective grief. We had to rely on the earth as she replenished. This moment asks of us to be giants in this world. And I know we are forever changed in this moment. We all are forever changed and are transformed. So from this place of transformation, can we imagine a new vision for our futures that pulls from legacy of imagination, power, healing, and freedom fighting? How do we ask ourselves as survivors of historical generational trauma, of white supremacy, gender supremacy, ableism, homophobia and transphobia? How will we remember what we have done to survive and what we can create with dignity? How are we healing from unresolved grief, from slavery and genocide, and now COVID-19? What can we learn in our blood, in our bones, in our cells, in our memory? Healing justice says we must and will be rooted in a liberatory practice that roots us in liberation movements, that we will build collective care and safety, and we will build liberation together. And we must draw on healers to be part of the political strategy of understanding how we will move and transform the earth and be moved and transformed by our struggles and our collective grief and transformation. At this present moment, the world is asking of us, what does it mean to be abolitionists? What does it mean to seek the defunding of the systems of police, to seek the defunding of, seek the closure of detention centers, to seek the closure of psychiatric institutions that pathologize and criminalize our communities? Sometimes it's hard for us to imagine before our people were policed, the time before we were imprisoned, enslaved, experimented on for centuries. But this is a new cosmology for freedom, a time to witness a more expanded view of what we will tear down and what we will build. If we only think of trauma and healing outside of ourselves, outside of movement, outside of political liberation, what a loss. Instead, we have to name how we will center collective care, safety, protection, and accountability for one another's safety and well-being. This is part of our political work. In closing, I want to share with you a poet's letter that I'm writing to June Jordan in response to her poem written in 1980, Sea to Shining Sea, a poem that was poignantly relevant to this moment, but she wrote it in 1980, so she was traveling portals of time, I believe. I'll read you an excerpt from the poem, Sea to Shining Sea, and then I'll read you my response. From June Jordan, a Black poet and freedom fighter. This is not such a hot time for you or for me. Natural order is being restored. Designer jeans will be replaced by the designer of the jeans. Music will be replaced by reproduction of the music. Food will be replaced by information. Above all, the flag will be replaced by the flag. This was not a good time to be gay. Shortly before midnight, a Wednesday massacre felled 8 homosexual Americans and killed 2. One man was on his way to a delicatessen and the other was on his way to a drink. Using an Israeli submachine gun, the killer fired into the crowd, later telling the police about the serpent in the garden of his bloody heart, and so forth. This was not a good time to be Black. Yesterday, the Senate passed an anti-busing rider, and this morning, the next head of the Senate Judiciary said he would work to repeal the Voter Registration Act. And this afternoon, the Greensboro jury fully acquitted members of the Klan and the American Nazi Party in the murder of 5 citizens, and in Youngstown, Ohio, and in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and in Brooklyn, and in Miami, and in Salt Lake City, and in Portland, Oregon, and in Detroit, Michigan, and in Los Angeles, and in Buffalo. Black American, Black women and men were murdered, and the hearts of 2 of the victims were carved from the bodies of the victims, etc. This was not a good time to be old. Streamliner's plans for the federal budget include elimination of Social Security as it now exists. Similarly, Medicare and Medicaid face severe reevaluation, among other things. This was not a good time to be young. Streamliner plans also include elimination of the Office of Education, and the military draft becomes a drastic concern as the national leadership boasts that this country will no longer be bullied and blackmailed by wars for liberation or wars for independence elsewhere on the planet and the like. This was not a good time to be a pomegranate ripening on a tree. My response, Dear June, This is to you and your lineage and our Black feminist futures. What is the natural order of disorder in the 21st century? This is not a good time to be living in a climate so fragile our natural resources hang in the balance like a moth near a flame, with the Amazons on fire and the massive breaking off of icebergs from Antarctica, but they tell us it will be all right. Yet we still put more money on Mars, white man's escape from our destiny. The natural order is still to be white, to be male, to be straight, to be able-bodied, wealthy, and Christian, to be a patriot or a member of QAnon. The natural order is still out of balance, swayed by white misogyny and ableist supremacy. We are at the mercy of a global virus and a civil war and a planet dying and fascism and a capital insurrection and a Confederate flag being flown on statesmen's lawns instead of hiding in their garages. This is still not the time to be Black, dying at an astronomical rate from COVID and police brutality. This is still not the time to be Asian, targeted by yellow peril and false notions of disease. This is still not the time to be immigrant and refugee, being exploited while fleeing persecution from our homelands. We lose our families and children at the borders. This is not the time to be Arab or Palestinian. This is still not the time to be queer and trans and gender nonconforming, with memories of the Pulse massacre still in our bones and the invisibility of Black and Latinx trans women still dying in massive numbers, unseen and unheard. This is not the time to be African or Latinx, to be sterilized in detention centers under the false guise of national security, when the natural order is still prisons and population control. This is not the time to be here alive under government regime and quarantine in a rent-free market with food insecurity and unemployment crises. This is definitely not the time to be living in Texas without water or electricity on a privatized grid. This is not the time to want the natural order of things when natural order is part of a patriot, no mask wearing government quarantine and fascism. The natural disorder of things is to ground in new cosmologies for freedom that ask of us to build interdependence, that my safety depends on your safety, that my well-being depends on your well-being, that until we confront the wounds of slavery and colonization, of imprisonment and capitalism, we cannot face one another. And the natural disorder is still to build power with the people not rooted in tyranny, but the people we believe are rooted in transformative justice, racial justice, healing justice. The natural disorder of things is to put the order down, is to put policing down, put control down, put profit down, put the violence and expendability down, and pick up imagination, pick up revolution, pick up revelation and dreams, and lean into the change that is the natural disorder of things, so that we will never return to the norm of what was already not working. Instead, we will manifest new cosmologies for freedom. Thank you.
Woo, thank you. I want to, shout for 100 people who are here. I'm so moved, and I know I speak for everyone when I say that your words and your teachings you went back to June Jordan in 1980. You went back to eugenics. You went back really far, but
Yes.
also spoke to this very particular moment that we are in, and reminded us that we maybe have not been in this exact place before.
Yes.
But we have seen, none of this is new.
That's right.
And there are so many themes that recur in our movements, and we have so much to learn from each other and from
Yes.
from people who came before us.
Yes.
And that we are not reinventing. We don't need to reinvent out of a whole cloth, but we need to bring what our wisdom to our movements too. So
Yes.
a huge heartfelt thanks for all of us. I know we would all be cheering for you if you could hear everyone.
Thank you. I'm cheering for all of us.
I want to remind everyone to put your name down for a book, and I just put that in the chat. And I'm going to turn it over to Q&A. Alina is going to moderate our Q&A. We have a few questions already, but please put your questions in the Q&A. All right, I'm turning it.
Hi, thank you so much, Ms. Page, for being here, and also thanks to all of our wonderful attendees. We're so glad to have the opportunity to have this conversation. So we've just started to get a few questions in the Q&A. As Naomi said, please be sure to add yours, and we'll do our best to get to yours. So the first one I'll start with says, they thank you for being here. They're wondering if you can speak more to what healing justice looks like in practice. What specific kinds of work are people doing now towards liberation?
Thank you. I tried to show that example when I talked about mutual aid networks, right? And just in terms of how are people taking care of each other on care and safety. I also was speaking to it when I exemplified centering healers, right? Energy, earth, body-based healers. So I just want to say sort of like more amorphously, but yes, we're looking at a rise of birth workers, in particular, birth workers that are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, queer and trans, people with disabilities that are actually shifting the narrative or the discourse of how we care for all bodies and value different people of color and people with disabilities birthing. Like that's I would say an extension of healing justice. We have a lot more collectives that are in existence across the country that work with movements. Literally, even Black Lives Matter has a whole strategy on healing justice where when they experience white supremacist violence in different actions, I have been a part of mobile units that have healers and health practitioners ready on deck to respond to and advocate for people who have been intensely policed during actions and rallies against police brutality. And we actually move with them to clinics, hospitals, where we can advocate and based on their self-determination, how to make sure they feel safe entering hospitals and clinics. Healing justice also looks like there are many organizations building up and training up practitioners to have a social justice lens and an understanding of how they might be participating in the the medical harms and abuses that are being repeated as a pattern of colonization and slavery. So how do we disrupt the very old narrative of what it means to be a doctor and a nurse in this country? How are we looking at integrative care models, working with different kinds of healers, valuing different kinds of bodies and genders when we think about healing and well-being that go beyond the discourse of healthy being fit or unfit, diseased, undiseased, right? That I tried to speak to very briefly. So essentially, I know of multiple organizations like the Latinx Therapy Network that's training up therapists to be transformative in their practices and rethink, not pathologizing people who've experienced immense trauma from migration, war, and torture. How are they integrating, how as therapists are they integrating transformative practices that rely on spiritual or other healing practices to support people who are survivors of trauma? Or another example is the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network that's working with queer and trans therapists of color to understand how can they transform their models of care to not just look at people individually, but actually look at collective trauma. How are we looking at communities? And so more people are working with collectives or communities inside of movements or inside of communities, instead of just siloing off. Of course, one-on-one is good, but we're talking about how do you actually build collective care and safety strategies? And so it means pooling people together to think about that in shared space. And then I'll give an example, Casa de Salud, an amazing clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that is rooted in a healing justice frame, and how they're building integrative care where one, it's all sliding scale. Two, they see families, not just individuals, but they actually see families as a whole unit when they're thinking about care and modality and healing. And they have a team of Western-based doctors that work with medicinal herbal practitioners, and they meet them together with the clients so that everyone is offered an integrative care model up front. And so they're not looking at the individual, right, as experiencing some ailment that isn't somehow connected to their conditions and to their families and to the communities that they're in. So I hope these are some good examples.
Yeah, no, I think that was really illustrative. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Another question we have, over the course of history, we have seen systems of oppression reinvent themselves in response to social movements and grassroots movements. In this period of change and regrowth, how do we anticipate these reinventions and build movements that respond to such retrenchment?
Yes, I was looking at that. It's interesting. Sorry, I just want to look at the writing of this. In this period of change and regrowth, how do we anticipate reinventions? I'm not there. I'm really, I want to quote Mariam Kaba, an abolitionist and transformative justice thinker and leader, who says, hope is a discipline. And I just, yes, people are reinventing the same tyranny, right? But what I'm saying is we have such a level of transformative movements right now, disability justice, transformative justice, healing justice. I think I want to put energy on that because yes, tyranny is supremacy is here. It will continue. I agree with you. Entrenchment will be more entrenched. But I'm trying to name a moment of elevation that we're having that I think is interrupting the frame and actually on a cellular level, changing the opportunities that we have to actually build power and infrastructure that can respond to this entrenchment. So I hope that answers the question. I don't know what they're doing over there, but I know what we're doing and I believe in it. So.
Okay. From another participant, what first steps would you recommend for a disabled person hoping to rely less on the medical industrial complex?
Right, beautiful question. I would ask, who are you not relying on, sorry, it's, who are you asking to be a part of your care strategy? So if you're defining living with a disability, what are the action or the strategies that you need to feel dignified, to feel cared for, and to feel safe? And have you shared that strategy with, and your desires or values around it with people that you're in community with, to say, can we build this interdependence together? Because I want to ensure my safety and well-being as a person with a disability that doesn't want to rely on state or corporate models, but I want to be in relationship. I'm assuming you want to be in relationship with a community that's being more than mindful, but actually rooted in exploring what does care and safety look like on a not a linear level, but a cyclical sort of complex level of the different ways you need to feel, that you can choose and have self-determination on how you are cared for, how you care for others, and how you feel safe, and how can other people work with you to ensure that safety. I think this is a collaboration. This is a collective learning, and it's going to take more than you to do it, right? So it's an invitation to others to join you on this quest and to ask, what do they need to feel safe and cared for? And what risk are they willing to take to support you around moving through an ableist lens of care, right? How are your allies, if you will, going to show up in supporting you in breaking the frame?
Thank you. How do you reaffirm your worth and stand true in your inherent value when the world around you tells a story of division, class stratification, based on race, feeling different, feeling physically unwelcome in a space? So how do you reaffirm your self-worth?
Yes, that is a very deep, well, these are all deep questions, but I definitely believe in calling on my ancestors. I would not be here if I didn't have ancestors that have called on me to be in the service of the work. And by ancestors, I mean both my family, but also ancestors of freedom fighters. I have to believe this is bigger than me. I am here to learn and struggle and become whoever I'll become because of all the other people that I'm in conversation with and in dialogue with and in action with to actually change these systems that we know are um, just so heavy on the spirit, heavy on the body, just heavy, weigh us down. So I just believe, and I am deeply rooted in the belief that I am doing this in the service of the work, that this is always in relationship to others, and I stay connected to others, and I get pushed and I struggle and I learn how to deepen my own analysis and my own practice. That keeps me alive and in relationship to what I believe keeps me here in it. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this next question is, I think, a difficult one, but it sort of follows. How can people who have lost connection with the healing practices of their ancestors or are from a culture that has annihilated its own traditional healing practices adopt healing practices for themselves without cultural appropriation?
Yes, and I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Certainly in the use of healing, we're talking about healing justice. We risked 15 or so years ago, we risked what that means, right? I often always talk about the cooptation of healing practices, the stealing of healing practices, especially from Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. So let me be clear, that is not what I'm inviting, right? There's a way to be, I believe, responsible and to be accountable, right, for how we learn of other practices. I think I always tell people, what does it mean to be rooted in place? So if you are already not on the land that your people are from, but what roots you in the center of your core? How do you embody the values of your communities? So I always tell people to little bit first go in, like, what is it that you remember your people have done to survive attempted genocide, slavery, or colonization? I think it starts there. Like, what is the crux of how you feel that you have made it this far? And what have you done to survive any kind of traumatic incident? But that is not just individual, but collectively. I think, again, we're looking at um, how practices, I guess how practices, the way that I speak about healing justice, it's rooted in movement. It's rooted in building power. So to be responsible in how you carry forth a practice and tradition, it also has to be rooted in power. Understanding if you have a relationship to a practice that you've co-opted from someone else, then you are disempowering. You're playing with the power dynamic of having the privilege to do a practice that isn't rooted in your lineage, that isn't rooted in your story. So I do think people have to reassess what are their practices and traditions and not focus on others, but focus on themselves and their communities. And if you're so disconnected from it, what can you create? I know that's a basic, I'm not trying to be, um, uh, you know, quick about it, but I say, well, if you are so disassociated because that's part of the plan, right, is to not remember, then what is it that you want to build and create? I would ask.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question, what role does electoral politics play in transformative and healing justice movements? Are these in opposition to each other, or is there a role for American democratic politics within such movements?
Oh, funny. I mean, healing justice is a social justice frame. I don't think of electoral politics as social justice. So I'm just going to be honest in saying that. I see it as a machination, right, of the system in this country. In other words, healing justice wasn't, the focus was not to elevate politics. It was to elevate movements that are building strategy to change systems, right? And so there's a very, very tricky question. I've never been asked this. I guess I'm not making the distinction on electoral politics. It's about the people, right? So who are the people you're trying to imagine looking at intervening on generational trauma from violence, slavery, genocide, and oppression? You see what I'm saying? I don't think that functions inside of just electoral politics. It's broader. So I would say expand the view. That's why I think I'm having a hard time answering it, because I think it has more to do with who are the communities you're working with that are inside of, yes, the electoral politic or Democratic Party, but who are they as a people? What communities do they represent, and where are they positioned or rooted in place in their relationship to understanding how violence or let's look at how care and safety has been deeply embedded in their political practice. That's the question. Because if you're going to, sometimes people don't use the term healing justice. They say, I believe in collective care and safety. What are we going to do to build that together? Fine, that's healing justice. Same idea. I bring the trauma piece in because I think we do a disservice in not naming that we are bringing forth collective trauma in our movement work. But we're still building collective care and safety. That's the ultimate goal, whatever you call it. So how does that become a part of building power? And if you're building power inside of the Democratic Party, let's say it's not the party, right? It's the people. How are you going to build with the people power around care and safety?
So considering that many of the people in this space are lawyers or future
Yes.
lawyers,
Yes.
we wanted to hear your thoughts regarding healing justice and lawyering. What role do you see for lawyers and the law in building new cosmologies based on transformative, racial, and healing justice?
Yes, thank you. I completely forgot to say lawyers. I called you scholars and community, but absolutely you have a role, right? Because you at times are meeting people at the crossroads of their trauma with the state, right? Of their trauma with corporations, literally in the court system or the penal system, the carceral systems, all the things. So I would say, I think there is multiple roles. I mean, I'm working with frontline healthcare workers, social workers, clinical researchers, and how they're going to bend and transform institutions that they're inside of, medical institutions that they want to disrupt. How are you going to disrupt the legal system so it doesn't continue to criminalize healers and practitioners that are being criminalized for their practices, like birth workers who can't hold home births, predominantly Black, Indigenous, and women of color who aren't able to hold home births because of the profit that it's seen as being a threat to the medical industrial complex. Like, I would ask, where are you willing to disrupt and take risk on shaking up the narrative of law being the only way to ensure safety? Like, what kind of risk are you willing to take for people who are choosing different ways to be safe that might be seen as illegal? Or even in street survival economy, I work a lot with sex workers who are building collective care and safety strategies, but it's considered they're being criminalized for their care and safety strategies. So how will you bend the law? What risks are you willing to take? What will you allow to disrupt or be disrupted? And how you advocate for change inside of a very linear structure? I think it's a question we should all be wrestling with. Maybe that's for the breakout groups. What you feel your role is in responding to generational trauma and to interrupting what has continually added to harms and abuses and build something new. Like, where does the law touch that, integrate with that? And I'll take it all the way to eugenics. There's still states with eugenic laws in the books. Please get rid of them. You know, like, there are different ways, I think, to advocate for how we decriminalize practice and healing.
Thank you. So I do want to be mindful of the time, and I'm glad that you plugged our breakout sessions that are coming up. So I think we are probably hitting our last question or so, maybe two more. But this one I think is a little bit fun. This person says, I love her citations, Kaba, Jordan, and of course, Dorothy Roberts. Can you say more about your personal canon?
Oh, my personal canon. Wow. I mean, I have a lot of people that I read. I mean, I actually skipped over it in my presentation. So let me just go to it because I thought as though I was running out of time. But I will say my canon includes Black and Indigenous and women of color, including Dr. Mindy Fullilove, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, Dorothy Roberts, Loretta Ross, Dr. Donna Davis, Dr. Kamara Jones, and Dr. Mary Bassett. Francisca Coronado of the Latinx Therapist Network, Dr. Michelle Morse of Equal Health and Campaign Against Racism. Many of these people have written articles or have podcasts, so on and so forth. Erica Woodland of National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network, Shira Hassan of Just Practice, Mariam Kaba of Survived and Punished, and with Andrea Ritchie, the Decriminalization Project or Anti-Criminalization Project, Ejaris Dixon and Leah Lakshmi Piapra Sinha, who wrote the book Beyond Survival that you all are going to dip into. There's so many. And Octavia Butler, I will land on that, and Winona LaDuke, people that absolutely inspire and transform me to think about future. That's the beginning of my canon, but that doesn't even touch poetry. So I'm a hold there.
Okay. Well, I think so.
Oh, and Alexis Gums, sorry, and
No,
Archive.
thank
You got to
you.
toss that in there too, and Adrienne Marie Brown, all the things. Yes.
Perfect. Well, actually, I think what I will do, since it's almost 7:30. I
Yes.
was going to ask another question to our attendees. I am so sorry if I didn't reach your question. We really appreciated all of your contributions. Please save them for the breakout rooms and get a chance to discuss amongst attendees. But since we've only got another minute or so, just go ahead and speak to the poets that you count among your canon, and we'll just have a full response to that question.
Wait, say again, because I went in and I saw. What's the question you're looking at?
I was going to ask you another question, but we were supposed to stop at 7:30. So since we're almost there, I was saying that you could go ahead and speak to the poets that you count among your canon. Many.
I was like off the cuff. I'm not sure. I mean, June Jordan's one of my favorites, but I forgot to say Tony K. Bambara, James Baldwin. I can't think of poets right now, but I'm sort of thinking of the architects, I think, of thought. Certainly the Combahee River Collective and Barbara Smith. So I'm just sort of adding to my list of fiction and nonfiction. And then Gloria Anzaldúa, Shari Mauraga. There's so many.
Yeah, I think that's plenty. I know I have a book list now. Like I'm ready to go out and do research. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll turn it over to Naomi to sort of wrap things up and transition us to the breakout.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alina, for leading us in the Q&A. And to Kara, again, we can't thank you enough. This has given us such a rich tapestry to mine and think about and reflect on. And I love that you ended with a reading list. There's so much more. So again, we are so grateful to you for joining us today. And just to kind of, I guess, maybe finish where I started. You mentioned several people who've been Sheinberg lecturers in the past. It really sort of showing the thread. And I, again, invite everyone to, we're in this moment where it's so easy to sort of access archival things. So I encourage people to do that. And just thank you again for building on that and really bringing so much together in your response and in your discussion.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to drop my website in and my IG if you want to follow to see more of the work that's out there, that's moving and shaking.
Great, great. So we'll have that. Great. So we'll have that in the that's in the chat, and the breakout rooms are also in the chat. It's one Zoom room. You'll go in there and then you'll be able to choose breakout rooms. So please join us there. And we really, we hope to see you in a few minutes there. And thank you again, Kara, for everything.
Yes, yes. My pleasure. It's been an honor to be here in community with all of you for this moment, this hot moment inside of all the things. Thank you very much for this honor in the name of Rose Sheinberg. Yes.
I'm gonna put the breakout rooms in the chat once more so people can go over to those. It looks like lots of people are going over there now already. So I will hold on a minute, but everyone can, you can make your way over to the reception, as we should say.